Hi, my name is Ricky Ford. I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you at the Alternatives Venue Jazz Talk with Gail Boyd. She sent me a number of questions, and if anybody has a question, they can ask me in the comments. Um, I play the saxophone, and I've been playing saxophone for more than 50 years, and I'm very happy to be here today to share some of my insights in music with you. Um, I got into jazz at a very early age. I started playing saxophone around 14, but I started really with drums around 12 years old. Um, I have a family that was into music. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, played guitar with the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, especially in the New York band. When they came to New York, she was one of the first New York musicians to work with her. Many years ago, I had a chance to talk to Jesse Stone when I was in Saratoga, Florida, for a jazz festival uh, pro- produced by the Saratoga Jazz Association. And he told me that my grandmother was one of the principal members of the band in New York, and she stayed there for about a year. And then she couldn't continue with the band because she was raising my mother and my aunt. But she still had her guitars, and she used to go back and teach some of the other musicians how to play the book. But by the time I was born, which was many years later, I used to visit her, and she would play the guitar for me and my brother. And so this is my first exposure to jazz, and she was a very consummate musician. And one of the first songs that we really heard her play was "Body and Soul," and "5 Foot 2 Eyes of Blues." She played a big yellow Gibson guitar, and I have very fond memories of seeing my grandmother play at her house. And later in my career, she used to come and hear me play when I was working with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. We would come to Boston sometime, and years later, I was teaching at Brandeis University. I had a big band there, and we used to do some concerts. I used to showcase musicians that never had their music played for big band before. Some of my principal guests were Steve Lacy. I did the music of Mary Lou Williams, had Mal Waldron there, Walter Bishop Jr., Harold Ashby, Stafford James, Jack Walrath. Kenny Burrell came and played once. And she came to one of my concerts and when I had a choir there. Um, so she was like actually the first musician that I heard. And other than that, before I actually heard my grandmother, my parents used to work at the Storyville Jazz Club in Boston, Massachusetts. My father was a bartender and my mother was a waitress there. And they brought me there once. And I remember seeing Dinah Washington doing the sound check. It was so strange. She was doing the sound check, but she was actually pressing her clothes at the same time. So she was on the bandstand, pressing her clothes and doing the sound check with a trio. And she saw me and said, "Oh, look at this little lovely baby!" And she gave me a hug and a kiss. And so that was actually one of my first times seeing a trio play with a vocalist, and she was doing the sound check. It was incredible. I was just young. I didn't know who Dinah Washington was until later, but I remember them saying, "This is Dinah Washington." And she saw me and said, "Wow." Um, First albums, that's a not such a hard thing, but I started playing around 1969, and at this point, and I already had listened to several albums that my parents had. They had Harry Belafonte, Sarah Vaughan, Stan Getz, Coleman Hawkins, Illinois Jacket, Charlie Parker CD. Most of these CDs were on Verve Records. They had a special Verve cover, a generic cover with Cityscape. But after that, when I started playing music, I started to play the tenor saxophone around 14, and I one of the first records I received was that I bought because at this point I was shining shoes at Logan Airport, and that was quite an experience. I only worked there for about a week. My parents were too happy that I was shining shoes, but I learned how to spit shine pretty well. Um, and Herbie Mann, Memphis Underground was one of my first albums that I bought. I also bought another album by Wes Montgomery. It was sort of like a Baroque setting called Scarborough Affair. And after that, Jimi Hendrix was pretty popular, and I bought a CD by Jimi Hendrix called Audio Experience. And that was right around the time when I really started playing saxophone. I said, I'd really like to play saxophone like Jimi Hendrix one day. But, sometimes you bend some notes. But those were my first CDs, and later I got really exposed to music with Rand Blake at the Community Services Department of Marine Conservatory, and he had an extensive record collection. Not in his office, but next to his office, he had a big 18 meter room with books and albums everywhere. And I remember seeing some of the first albums there of Coltrane, Max Roach, Charles Mingus, things like this. Quite a extensive repertoire that he had in his library. And he used to stress playing by ear, and so we really got into a lot of ear training there at the Community Services Department. Eventually, I got a chance to make several CDs with Rand Blake. The most recent ones we made was Chevron Noir, uh, and another one dedicated to Chris Connor. So these are two CDs that we did together. We actually recorded them in Belgium, um, and they just came out a few years ago. I think around 2014 or something like that. My current projects is I'm playing in saxophone with a quartet in France, and I also have a quartet that I'm doing in America. I've been pretty proactive in producing music in America in the last few years. This quartet is featuring Barry Altschul on drums, Jerome Harris on bass, and Mark Soskin on piano. And we made a recording last summer um, with Neil Weiss at the Whaling City Sound Records, and I'm very proud to announce this release. It just came out in April. It's called The Wailing Sounds of Ricky Ford, and it's, it's consecrated to the memory of Paul Gonsalves. But I also had another input from some of the music of Coleman Hawkins on this CD, plus several originals that I've written for this CD. Um, Exploring the music of Duke Ellington with Harry Carney, because Harry Carney was a neighbor of mine. I mean, he wasn't living in Boston when I was there, but his house was right around the corner from mine in Roxbury on Humboldt Avenue. My father grew up with Johnny Hodges, and I remember hearing the Duke Ellington Orchestra many times at the Playhouse in the Park. It was a concert series founded by Elmer Lewis. Also went to school at her African American Artists Institute in Boston. And I got a chance to meet Mercer Ellington one year during a reception after the Duke had passed away. And she told Mercer that I was one of her most promising students. And I got a chance to go on the road with Mercer Ellington in the summer of 1974, of August. Harry Connick was still in the band, and we toured about 2 or 3 weeks all over the Midwest. And around October, Harry Connick got ill and couldn't play anymore. He passed away, and Mercer called me up to join the band. And so the beginning of my career was actually taking Paul Gonzalez's place in this band, and it was a great experience for me. We traveled all over the world, all over America, and I got a chance to see this music firsthand at this time of my career. And we made a CD in Chicago, um, and the musicians they would give you some type of advice. They'd say, "Make sure you develop your solos. Don't start out too fast. Pace yourself." I was a very close friend with Cootie Williams, and he gave me a lot of encouragement. Um, on and off the bandstand. I mean, we used to eat together every day. I mean, he was like a consummate lexicon of knowledge. He'd always tell you stories. Some of the stories were pretty funny, but some of them were pretty serious too. I mean, he was very dedicated, serious musician, and he really loved to see young musicians carry on the tradition of jazz. And he was very encouraging about this. And he'd always say, make sure you keep your focus on the music and blah, 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 this and that. Harry Connick, too, was pretty funny also. He used to say, young man, if you think you're going to get in trouble, just keep that horn in your mouth. I'll never forget that one. Practicing all the time. All the time. Excuse me, I'll take a drink. It's only water. We just got, I was in Paris earlier today, and right now I'm in the Bourgogne, and it's not raining here yet, but it's almost raining. And it's a little bit humid here in the country, but it's kind of calm. Hear the crickets, see the stars. I know I just talked about my jazz project with the quartet, and I also have some other type of projects that I've been working on throughout my career with the big band. Um, Post university explorations. I've been working with a big band in Paris for many years, and I produced a couple of CDs with them. It's called the Z Big Band. One of them was called 7095, and the other one is called Sacred Concert. This Sacred Concert was something that I did actually before I moved permanently to France around 1990. No, take that back. I already moved to France, but one of the last projects that I did in America was for the 100th anniversary of my family church at St. Bartholomew's. And this church, all of my family went to this church, and my aunts, my grandparents, my grandfather, and Roland Braithwaite was the organist. And he encouraged me to do a sacred concert for the church, and he gave me some many source materials. And so I wrote a sacred concert for big band, and it was one of the first big bands to play in the rectory of the church. Actually, the first. Normally, they never had music in the rectory other than the organ and choir. And I did this big band with my students, my former students in Boston, and years later, I got a chance to record this music in France with the Z Big Band, and we made a CD. It's called Sacred Concert, but it's actually a very significant CD. It's one of the first big band sacred concerts in jazz with original music and the spirituals done since Duke Ellington's sacred concerts. So it's a milestone project for me. Um, and so I did this back in 2011. I made the CD. So this is one of the cornerstones of some of the music that I've been working on, and more recently, I've been doing some music based on poetry. I just before the pandemic, I was supposed to do a concert in Boston with a Wakanda project um, with John Kodaleski in Boston, and this project was supposed to happen in March of 2019. But the pandemic hit, and I had to come back to France very quickly, so I never did do it. But it was music that I wrote inspired by the poems of Langston Hughes. And I got this idea a few years ago. I was visiting a friend of mine, a filmmaker named Mishka Sal. She passed away a few years ago. But she produced uh, a film about me in France called A Great Day in Paris. And this film was a photo shoot of all of the expatriate musicians living in France, plus many other French musicians were there too. And we did this, and she documented this in a film. And so years later, I got a chance to go see another project that we did called Spoon. It's based on the poetry of Spoon Jackson and her correspondence with Spoon Jackson, who's been incarcerated in California for many years. And so we went to see the opening of her film about Spoon Jackson. And while I was staying in her house, I got a chance to look at some of her library, and I found a Langston Hughes book, and I started writing music from based on the readings of his poems. And I continued this when I got back to France with a small group, and then I decided to do it for big band. And this was supposed to happen in 2019, but it never did happen. But we did it this year in May. May 14th, we did the premiere of this concert, and you could actually see it on Facebook. It's called the Maconda Project, Langston Hughes. And we featured many musicians from Boston, and we also featured the, the poetry of Langston Hughes with a poet named Mr. Torre. Um, he did the poetry. Also did a solo project also a few years ago, but this the solo project was a little bit before I did the Langston Hughes project. And the solo project was something that I developed while I was teaching in Turkey at the Istanbul Bilgi University. Um, Based on the music of Nazan Tevfik. And so I did this Turkish Ney transcriptions. And it hasn't been released, but sometimes I do this solo concert. And one of the inspirations that I had for my CD on the Wailing Sounds of Ricky Ford was a song called Fur. It's actually based on the makam of Fahrenheit. And this makam is very particular. Uh, it has major and minor inflections in it. So I was able to write a song based on this makam, and it's featured on my new CD. Um, I also talked about some of the older musicians that have given me advice. I used to study at the New York Conservatory with Joe Allard. Joe Allard was one of my first teachers on saxophone, and he used to work with Toscanini, and he taught many other saxophonists of my generation, uh, Michael Brecker, David Liebman, Steve Grossman, and I was just starting out to play music back then. He taught me how to read music, and he gave me many insights about playing the saxophone. And he never wanted you to play like anybody else. And he always had a stack of transcriptions that his other students would bring to them. But he would never let me read these transcriptions. I always would have to listen to the music, but he never encouraged me to read transcriptions. But later in my career, I actually did these transcriptions of Les Antifiques, which is something a little bit different because after spending most of your career improvising, sometimes you have to do something that is more attuned to what you never did before. It's more related to classical music, reading. But when you put your own experience into this type of expression, it's a little bit different than if you're starting out without any experience and just reading music. So it's a great challenge uh, to read music in a performance setting, other than doing improvisation. But these chances you have to take sometime, and you have to be careful that when you are reading music, that you, being that you're an improviser, as an improviser, you're not really doing too much repetitive movement with your instrument, and so it's better if you concentrate on improvising if you're a jazz artist. And if you are a classical musician, uh, you always have to pay attention to repetitive movements when you're reading music. Or maybe you don't read the same music all the time. And maybe you shouldn't even practice the same practice regimens all the time. What I usually do when I practice, or at least in the beginning of when I was a student, I would divide my practice into two different types of formats. One format is very disciplined of what you're trying to do as reading music or practicing scales, and the other practicing was a little bit more undisciplined in doing things that you wanted to do that had nothing to do with discipline, uh, improvisation, exploring your instrument. As a musician, if and when you're younger, if you're living at home, you should really take advantage of the time that you have to practice your instrument as much as you can. When you get to school, at least if you're going to music school, you're going to have a little bit more academic obligations, and so maybe you can't practice as much. But what you should do is practice um, a certain hour every day. And if you practice a certain hour every day, this can be a good way for you to accumulate uh, a regime, a regime of practicing and still allowing yourself enough time to do something else during the day. Okay, so I see some questions, so maybe I should answer some of these questions. I I came back to France. So the Michelle Hendricks thing was quite a long time ago, but I've been here since. So I've been in back and forth between America and New York. Okay, so me, when I practice, I usually try to practice a couple hours every day. I mean, if you practice 1 hour a day, it's even good. Benny Carter used to practice 1 hour a day. I mean, when he got up into his career, practicing is something that you really have to think about. And another thing that you have to think about as a saxophonist, and maybe as an instrumentalist, but more as a saxophonist, is the maintenance of your instrument, especially if you're a younger musician. If your horn is not maintained well, it becomes very much harder to play. And if you're a younger musician, if your horn becomes harder to play, you're more apt to lose interest in playing the instrument because it's harder to play. So if your parents out there, keep an eye on your child's instrument to make sure that it's always in good working order. And, I know. How can you tell if your child's saxophone is not in working order? If they lose interest in playing, it could mean that the horn needs some type of repair. And this is uh, something that's always ongoing with wind instruments. I remember I made a record with Sonny Stitt. And he used to say, "Oh, if your horn is out of repair, man, it just makes you work a little bit harder. You just brush it off, that's not a big deal. Of course, it's not a big deal. If you're a professional, it's not a big deal. But as a young student, it can be something that it inhibits your development a little bit. Keep your fingers close to the horn. I mean, you could check leaks with cigarette paper. If the cigarette paper is moving under the pads, maybe you have a leak. Um, I've been doing a lot of research about the saxophone, and been reading a lot about Adolph Sax, and he had some type of advice for saxophonists that you can really understand, that translates even today. He'd say some of the big defaults in pedagogy in teaching the saxophone, or when someone plays the saxophone, sometimes they try to sound like a flute, or try to sound like a clarinet, or they try to sound like a cello. And this is really not the way to approach the saxophone. It's a big error if you're trying to sound like another instrument, because the saxophone has a unique sound to it. And this sound comes from you. Every person has their own unique sound on the saxophone. And so if you translate this into today's mode, if you're not supposed to sound like a flute, or you're not supposed to sound like a clarinet, or you're not supposed to sound like a cello, you're not supposed to sound like anybody else but yourself. Right? You shouldn't sound like Charlie Parker. You shouldn't sound like John Coltrane. You shouldn't sound like Lester Young. You shouldn't sound like Joe Henderson. It's an incredible connection. If you're not supposed to sound like a flute, you're supposed to sound like yourself. And of course, you need to study music. You need to listen to music, but you also have to have an objective idea of when you're listening to other musicians. And it's a it's something that you really have to discipline yourself to and stick to your guns. If you want to sound like yourself, you're going to really have to stick to your guns to sound like yourself because there's a lot of peer pressure to sound like somebody else. Oh man, if you're not sounding like this, if you're not doing like that, if you're not doing like that, but you need to focus on your own identity when you're playing music. This is very important. Um, you have to take chances. You just can't sit back and not take chances. No pain, no gain. And you need to find your peers and work with your peers. And peer groups is very important for your developing as a musician. If you're a young musician, you need to find young kids to play with. If you're an older musician, you need to find other musicians to work with. If you're an amateur, you need to find people to play with and to explore your outlook on what you want to do as a musician. I mean, everybody doesn't have to be a professional to benefit from music. Music is something that is very beneficial to you in terms of health and in terms of a certain gratitude that you can find from playing music, writing music. I mean, most of the musicians that we hear about uh, wrote music all of their lives, and maybe they weren't even fully appreciated during their time. But in our time, we're able to appreciate uh, musicians. A lot of the great musicians uh, sacrificed a lot of their lives to create music, and it really never did see any. Well, of course, they see benefits. The benefits that they would see would be from the actual performance of their music, and this is very important. For you to perform your music. If you're writing music, you should seek out ways to have it performed. It's something that is not only beneficial to you, but beneficial to your peers. I mean, we just don't have to sit around and play standards all day. I mean, you can write music. You can import yourself to doing a certain type of expression that is original, even if you're not a professional musician. I mean, everything is not cut and dry for you to. Professional musician is it's a domain that you really have to dedicate your life to, and sometimes it's just a little bit more difficult. I mean, just look, we just had this pandemic, and during the pandemic, many people had to really dig inside themselves and to see what they really were about as a musician. Um, Me, during the pandemic, I didn't play my saxophone at all for about 9 months. Didn't touch it. Thought about it, wrote music, but I don't even know if I wrote music. I didn't even touch my horn. A good 9 months, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you've been playing for 50 years and something like a pandemic comes up, and there's not a lot of clear information about what you should do. I mean, first of all, you're supposed to use hydrochloric hand wash all the time. Right there, that's a red flag right there. How are you going to put the reed on your saxophone? How are you going to play? Impossible. And plus, there's not enough information about what you should do as a musician or as to keep yourself healthy. And so my attitude was, I'll just leave the horn in the case, point, and not really stress about it. Um, and that's a discipline right there. Uh, don't play your horn, but sometimes it happens like that. And so when information became more clear about what you should do, um, health wise, okay, there's less transmission and all this stuff. You have the vaccinations and blah blah this, and vaccinations are working well, and okay, it's time to take the horn out again. But for 9 months, there was a giant cloud about what anybody should be doing, especially as a saxophonist. You always have to put the reed on your horn, and you have to really think about that. But these things happen, and you have to be prepared to think about what you're doing as a musician and as for your health also. And, your health is very important. Um, if you keep yourself, music can help you to be very healthy. It's a meditative aspect to music also. And it's all, I mean, playing the saxophone is very a physical situation, cardiovascular. You're using all of your mind. You're using your dexterity of your fingers. Uh, and this is really going on with most of the music that you play. If you're playing the violin, if you're playing the flute, if you're playing the piano, all of these things are common denominators for your physical being as a musician. This is the music is a food for you. It's a food for thought. It's a food for your regeneration of your brain cells. It's a regeneration of your mind. And music is a fountain of youth. Most of the musicians they play what they were playing when they was a teenager. Their styles uh, don't change. I mean, if you look at all of the great musicians that lived into their 90s, and there's been quite a few, and their styles have been consistent throughout their entire careers. And this is what we really have to aspire for as musicians to be true to ourselves and to realize that music is a gift uh, that not everybody can appreciate, but everybody can appreciate it if they put themselves. And, if you're a young musician and you want to play music, you should play music. Point. Dedicate your life to playing music. There's nothing wrong with it. When I came up, there weren't any young musicians playing music, and it was a big challenge for me to go into something like this without a peer group. I mean, I had a peer group in Boston, but by the time I got to New York, my peer group was mostly older musicians: Jimmy Cobb, Walter Booker, John Hicks, uh, Jackie Byard. Hey, Curtis, what's up, man? Curtis Lundy. Now he was peer. He was one of my peers. Um, George Coleman, And of course, when I got to Mercer, there was Cootie Williams, Harry Connie. Later, I played with Charles Mingus, Danny Richmond, Jack Walrath, uh, Howard Johnson, Reggie Workman. These guys were my peers. Mal Waldron, I worked with Mal Waldron. Joe Williams, Nat Adderley, Red Rodney, McCoy Tyner. But I was always a young guy in the band. You Now there's m- many youngsters who are not young anymore, and they've been playing. Their careers have been going on for more than 30 years now. Man, I left New York about 30 years ago, but we never forget where we come from, and this is very important. Never forget where you come from. Music is your life. If you're a musician, it's your life. And I'm so happy to come to an alternative venue of jazz to talk with you about this, Gail Boyd. And I'll see you on the next one. You know, this, maybe not the last one, but if you get to the record store, you can check out the Wailing Sounds of Ricky Ford, Paul Scene. And if you're in Paris on June 25th, this June 25th, come and check me out. And I'll see you guys, girls, another time.